All right, well, welcome to the summer 2018 exam 2 workshop. I'm doing this review on the spring 2018 exam 2 test. So we're going to go through the test and we're going to just review the code for you and hopefully this will explain how the test format is for you guys. Okay, for question 1, we're going to be doing the same thing we did for question 1 in exam 1. So let's see what he gives us. The text area to the left contains data on the top 50 bowlers in the USA. And the DT for the data below is for the data below. So don't worry about this. It's just the XML he's doing. He'll do the XML formatting and clean up for us, and he'll put it all in the boot. So let's just read the question. So when the exam1 button is clicked, it'll roll out the XML data into a 50 row by 3 column table, right? Begin your code assuming that that the root has already been defined in code. So that's again the XML right here. It's already been cleaned up and put into the root child nodes for you. Count the total number of times the exact string JBT appears inside of the info text. Please place the resulting table in div with ID equals P1 out. And after the end of the table, show the count of JBT string of the JBT string. All right, well, go to the end of the table. We see that he has the string JBT count, which shows how many times JBT appeared in the info tag. So info tag, what he means by the info tag is when it appears inside the info column. So the info column is going to be the third column. So let's take a look at this root.child structure. So how the root.child structure works is, so for example, let's use the first row as an example. So we're giving the row loop is for I equals 0, I is less than root.channels.length, I plus plus. So what the root.channels.length is going to do is the length method is going to count how many child nodes is in this root. So what that means is, as you can tell, he told you earlier that this was going to be a 50 row by 3 column table. So what you can assume from this is that there's going to be 50 child nodes in this root folder, or this root. So he calls it an XML tree structure, but it's also similar to that of a folder within a folder structure. So pretend we have the root, right? The root folder. Pretend pretend each of these folders is a child node. Let's pretend there's about 50 of them in here. I've only made 5 of them, just for the purposes of as an example. So if there's 50 child nodes or folders inside this root, that means it's going to loop 50 times. So as long as I is less than 50, keep looping. That's the row loop. And finally, we have this other information. So the rank data is stored in the root.child nodes I, that child node 0, that child node 0, that node value. So that I we get from the row loop. We've already established it up here that it's going to be the counter for the row loop. I equals 0. So pretend we're on our first loop and we're still on the first row. So in the root.child nodes 0, remember I is equal to 0, that child node 0. So we'll use this folder example as an example. So in the root folder, in the child node 0, in that child node 0's inner child node 0 is another child node 0, and that node value of that inner child node is 50. So that's where 50 is stored. It's stored inside the child node 0 and child node 0 of that child node 0 and the child node 0 of that child node 0. And that node value of that child node 0 is 50. So let's go to the next data, where the next data is stored. The name, the second column, right? So the name is stored. What's the name that is stored in this child node right now in the first loop is root.childnodes 0, .childnodes 1, not 0 but 1, that child node 0, that child node 0 of that one child node, the node value of that's going to have William, right? William, the name. And finally, the third column, where the info is going to be root.child nodes 0, that child nodes 2, and then that child nodes 2 is a child node 0, and that node value, the dot node value of that child node 0 is a fixture on NM dash text all star teams, etc., right? Right here, the third column. That's where the data is stored, right? So as you can see, the different data is stored in different spots, but it branches off from the root folder. So, but let's take a look at the second row, right? The second row, instead the rank is at 49, right? That's because we finished one whole row, right? So that means I has incremented by 1, and I is now 1. So if we go in here, root.child nodes 1, the child node 0 of that child node 1, and the child node 0 of that 0, that node value contains the rank number of 49, right? And the name that's stored in child nodes 1, dot child nodes 1, and that child nodes 1, 0, that node value, what's going to be stored in this node value of 0 is the name Matt Jones, right? Matt Jones. And finally, the info and the root.child nodes 1, the child nodes 1, and that child nodes 2, and the child node 0 and that child node 2 is going to have the node value of the 1996-97 handicap bowler of the year, etc., the info, the third column stuff. As you can see, the different data branches off from the root, and it branches off from this 0 child node and this 1 child node. This 0 child node has different information as branches than the information in the branch of the child node 1. So you see he's already separated the data into nice clean pieces for you already. And so now you just need to know how to roll all that data out into a table as shown below in the 50 row by 3 column table. So let's take a look at the code. So the first thing in the code, this is where function P1 is. So don't worry about this. This is the XML cleanup he does to stick it into the root.channels structure to read the data from. So the first thing we're going to do, remember, he told us that we have to keep track of how many times the string JBT appears inside the resulting info tags. Hold on. Resulting info tags, right? And the info tag column is the third column, right? So if we're going to keep count of the total amounts that JBT appears, we need to create a variable to be the counter of that total. So we're going to so he uses JBTC for JBT count, and he sets it to 0 to start the counter at 0. And the first thing we got to do when we want to start a table is always to create a variable and store the beginning table tag in. So as usual, OS equals table tag border equals 1, right? And now we need our our row loop. But notice he's already given us our row loop. So as for I equals 0, I is less than root.childnodes.length, I plus plus. You see, he gives us that row loop. And so this is the exact code he uses for the row loop as well. For I equals 0, I is less than root.childnodes.length, I plus plus. Remember, there's 50 rows. That means there's 50 child nodes in this root. But child nodes.length is just, the length is just going to count how many child nodes is in the root. So we're going to assume it's going to be 50 because as you can see, he says it's going to make a 50 row by 3 column table. And there's 50 rows in this table. 1 to 50, right? Okay. So that takes care of the row. It's what do we always do at the beginning of the row loop? when we're making a table. A we gotta start the beginning table row tag, right? So OS equals OS plus table row tag. So that starts our row for every time we make a loop in this row and this row loop. And now notice he's made and now we have our column for j equals 0. J is less than 3 because there's 3 columns, right? J plus plus. But notice also that in this root.childnodes, we already have I defined in the for loop. So I is always going to be the same for each one of these child nodes. And the last child node is always going to be 0, but the middle child nodes is different from each other. It starts from 0, 1, 2. So that means if we use j of the counter we're using to keep count of how many columns we have, it's going to go from 0, 1, 2. And so we're going to let the loop keep looping through the child nodes for us so we don't have to write this 3 different times. And that's exactly what he does in here, right? So OS equals OS table data tag. And inside that table data tag, we're going to, in between the table data tag and the ending table data tag, we're going to put the information we need into the table and roll it out. So as you see, in that table data tag is the data we're given inside here in the root structure. So root.childnodes I, .childnodes j, right? Because we want the I to be a part of whatever row we're on, and the j to be a part of whatever column we're on, right? Because the column is going to go from 0, 1, 2, and so that way it's going to loop through, when it does the first column, it's going to loop through that first, and then it's going to change the middle child nodes from 0, 1, and 2, from 0 to 3. So 0, 1, 2, right? So, so just from this one line alone, we've already completed all 3 columns in that table row, the first table row. And so we end it with an ending table data tag, and that's going to stick it to one cell. And finally, remember that he also told us that we need to count every time the string JBT appears inside all of the info tags. Remember, the info tags, where's the info data? The info data is in right here, as in the third child node, and child node 2, child node 0 dot node value. And that's the third column on this table, right? And remember, we already have a counter that's keeping track of which column we're on. It's the J, right? So if J equals 2, remember J starts at 0, so 0, 1, 2. 2 is the third column. And that means when J is on the third column, we're going to stick whatever's in that root.childnodes I.childnodes J dot 0. So remember, I is always changing, but this J is always going to be 2 because this if statement is only going to run if it's J is at 2. So, and remember the middle child node 2 is always the info column, the info data in the third column. So we're going to stick whatever's in that data into a variable called temp, right? So we're using that temporary data variable because we want to search through that temporary variable and see if JBT exists in that string that we stuck into temp. So to do that, so he uses the temp.index of while method. So what this does is while the temp.index of JBT is greater than negative 1, remember, index of returns the position of whatever it's searching for, the first position number of where whatever it's searching for. So if temp.index of can find JBT in the temp variable, it'll return a position. And remember, the first position in a string always starts at 0. So if it can find the position of JBT, then that means the number index that it's going to return is always going to be greater than negative 1. It's always going to be 0 or higher. So if it finds it, it's going to return a number, and it's going to go ahead and do this loop. So in that loop, we're going to do temp equals temp dot replace JBT with a blank. The reason, and then we're going to increment JBTC by 1 because that means we found JBT. So we're going to increase the counter by 1 each time we find JBT. But the reason we're doing a JBT is because if we don't replace the JBT, that means JBT is always going to exist in the temp variable. And if it always exists in the temp variable, that means it's always going to find JBT and we're never going to break out of this loop. And also, we also want it done this way because if we just use the if we just do a JBT count and we don't do a replace JBT, then well, actually, yeah, it won't break out of the loop. But there's also the possibility that, as you see, there's one JBT in this first row. But if we see, and let's see, in some of these other rows, there's maybe one, there more than one JBT. There could be 2 or 3 JBTs. So we want to keep count of all of them. But if we only do a replace once, or replace outside the loop, then that means it would never break out of this loop because the the replace method only replaces the first instance of the thing it's replacing. And we put in a loop, that means it's gonna force it to keep replacing the first instance finds until there's no JBT string left in that string. And that's how we're gonna keep count of how many times JBT is found in the string. Because every time it replaces and then finds JBT, the position of JBT, and then we're gonna count it once, right? So now that we have a counter that is gonna count as we go through the loops of rolling out a table, then we've basically finished all that we need to. And last thing we need to do now is close out everything. We gotta close our table row tag at the end of our row loop, right? So you see the row loops from here to here. So the first thing we did was open a table row tag. Now we gotta close. The last thing we do in this row loop is we're gonna close the table row as we move on to a new table row. And finally, once we close all the table rows, the last thing we need to do to finish the table is we have we have an opening table tag. Now we need to close it with the ending table tag. So OS equals OS plus ending table tag, concatenate. And now remember, he also told us to display the count of how many times JBT appeared in the info tags column. So as you can see here, his count is string single quotation JBT single quotation count equals 24. So we're gonna add to the end of this table the string quotation mark JBT quotation mark count equals the JBTC counter that we had earlier, dot toString. And remember, JBTC is an integer because we kept adding to it, and HTML only takes strings, so we need to parse it into a string by using the dot toString method. And from that, we've stuck everything into OS, and our OS variable now has the whole table and the string that has the counter of how many times JBTC appeared or JBT appeared inside the info column. And from then on, it's just a matter of outputting the table to HTML by doing P1 out that enter HTML equals OS, because remember he said that the execute P1 out, the execute P1 button click is going to output the table in. So that means we have a div block with P1 out, and so we want to output the table to the div block P1 out. So P1 out that enter HTML equals OS accomplishes that. And that's it. That's it for question 1. Not too bad, not too hard. Now, on to question 2. This is quite a tricky question, actually. All right. All right. Well, let's look at question 2. I'm gonna try my best I can as we go through the steps and try to logically explain this, but this is quite a tricky question, so bear with me. So let's start by reading the question. So, Question 2 asks you to create a display of a 5-row by 4-column key numeric pad layout with 18 keys. An HTML version of the key pad layout is shown to the left using an HTML table. So he's talking about this picture right here. This is the HTML version of this key layout. You are to make another version using 18 div blocks to create the faces of the key. Assume each div block begins like this. So div start value equals the div tag with CSS with a bunch of CSS attributes he already has pre-made for you. So basically he's saying that assume that in the code he's already made this div start value variable and it has all this it has the beginning div tag with a bunch of CSS attributes in it. So if you look in the code, it's right here. And so the actual test answer starts from OS equals, right? And so now the next information gives us, we're given an array that he's already made called button text that has 20 different string elements in it for the 20 different keys, right? So as you can see, the first element in this button text array is numlock, right? Right here, numlock. And the second element is forward slash, right? And so on, asterisk, asterisk, minus sign, and that minus sign or dash, right? So those are the 20 things we're going to use, and we're going to roll it out into this H div CSS div block version of this HTML table. Okay, so let's start this step by step as we did for question 2 for the midterm, as we did for exam 1, right? So we'll do this step by step, one by one, okay? So step number 1, start an empty string named OS, right? And start an index name which key at 0. So as usual, we're going to create a variable called OS and have it, and we're going to set it to have nothing in it. We're going to make it a string, but we're going to have it set to have nothing. So if you look in the code, OS equals blank. So it's still a string, but it just doesn't have any like words or letters in it yet. And also next up is start an index name which key at 0. So we're going to create what he means is we're going to create a variable called which key and set it at 0, and we're going to use it as an index for something in the array, and the only array we're given is button text. So we're going to assume that we're going to use this which key variable as the index number for this array button text. And so if you look in the code, the which key variable is stated here and is set to 0, right? All right. Step number 2, use 2 loops. The outer loop for the rows 0 to 4 and the inner loop for 0 to 3. So what that means is we're going to have an outer loop for loop for 0 to 4. So it's going to loop about 5 times. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's going to be a 5 times loop for the 5 different rows. 1, 2, 0, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And to create an inner loop for the columns, right? 0 to 3. So it's going to loop 3 times. 0, 1, for the columns. Yeah. Loops. Yeah, loop 4 times. 4 times, excuse me. 0, 1, 2, 3, right? So this extra information gives you the inner loop will be executed 20 times. So some people might get tricked by this, but this is just information he's giving you. What he means by that is he's not telling you to put another loop inside this column loop. That's another for loop that's going to loop 20 times. What he's trying to tell you is this inner column, because it loops 4 times per one loop of the outer column, it's going to loop 20 times in total because four times one row, and this outer loop is going to loop 5 times. 5 times 4 equals 20. That means this inner loop is going to happen 20 times. That's all he's trying to tell you. So let's look in the code and see how he did that. So as you can see right here, he starts the row loop. Like he said, it's going to loop 5 times, 0 to 4. Starting at 0 is less than 4, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so it's going to loop 5 times. So we're going to do this in order. And so inside, we're going to make an inner loop for the column. So right here, for c equals 0, c is less than 4. Remember, it's going to loop through the column 0, 1, 2, 3. So starting at 0 all the way to 3 because 3 is less than 4. So loop 4 times in total. Pretend this left value equals 7 isn't here yet. Pretend all this. We're just going to do this in order of steps, right? So step number 3. Each time through the inner loop, inside the inner loop, consider the value of the button text array at the which key index. And to consider it, he's giving you a code for it. If, or he's not giving you, he's giving you a condition. If button text at the index of which key is equal to blank, in example, an empty string, do nothing. This will happen twice. Otherwise, else, otherwise, do these substeps if it has something inside the inside the button text array at the which key element. If it is not an empty string, then do these substeps. So let's see how he did it. So he does it this way. So how he does it is if the button text of which key does not equal an empty string, if it's not empty, then we're going to do the substeps, right? So if it's not empty, what is the first step in the substep? So again, we're going to do this in order by steps. So add div start value to OS, right? The next step right here, we haven't done this all these if statements yet. Pretend we've only done this part. OS, we don't have the if and else statement yet. We've done OS equals OS plus div start data, right? Remember that div start data is the variable he gave us earlier up here. Div start value equals the div block with CSS style with a bunch of CSS styles in it already pre-made for us, correct? So that's substep number 1, right? Now, substep number 2 is if the button text at the which key index is either a plus sign or the key enter string, add a height of 80 to OS. This will happen twice. So this is where we start doing the if else statement. So if it's a plus or an enter, then we're gonna add a CSS attribute height plus of height of 80 pixels, right? So remember the first thing we added. So let's look in the code how we did that. So you see right here we've done that, but now we're doing the if else statement, right? So when you're going through this test, make sure when you're writing your code on your test to leave a good amount of room between your code so that when you need to go back through your code and re-add stuff that you didn't know you needed to add beforehand, you have room to be able to do that. Like for example, this if else statement. So like he said, if the button text at the which key index is equal to an enter or button text at which key index is equal to a plus sign, then add a height of 80 pixels CSS element to OS, right? Remember, we originally had this already. So if we're gonna add to OS, we might as well stick it at the end of when we're adding the start data, the div start data to OS. So that's only for, remember he said only add 80 pixels if it's an enter or plus C. So everything else is gonna be at 40 pixels. Right, see? Else add height 40 pixels to OS. So now we're gonna make an else statement after that if statement. And we didn't have this before, but now we need to make sure the div start data has a height of 40 pixels instead of 80 pixels. So in the else statement, we're going to put OS equals OS plus the div start data, because remember we did it up here, so we have to do the exact same, because otherwise it's not going to have the beginning div block with the CSS values in OS if it's not an enter or a plus sign. So make sure we're going to add div start data. And instead of height at 80 pixels, we're going to do 40 pixels like he told us. So OS equals OS plus div start data concatenate at the height of 40 pixels. So that finishes the step of substep number 2. Now substep number 3. This is where things start getting tricky. So add the top and left CSS value to OS. So we're going to add the top and left CSS value to OS, right? And he tells us each row is going to be 40 pixels tall. Each column is going to be 40 pixels wide. And this, so what he means by each row is going to be 40 pixels tall and each column is going to be 40 pixels wide is saying each of these blocks, these div blocks, is going to be 40 pixels wide from here to here, and it's going to be 40 pixels tall from the bottom of the div block to the top of the div block, right? 40 pixels wide, 40 pixels tall, right? So start the top initially at 8 pixels and start the left at 7 pixels in each row. So let's look at this carefully. So he's saying we're going to start the top of the div block initially at 8 pixels from the top. So does you see how this div block is about 8 pixels away from the top part of this div block, right? Of this box. We're putting the div blocks in. So it's 8 pixels away from the top, right? So every column in here is about 8 pixels away from the top. So we want to set that initially. So we want to set that initially at 8. So we need to create a variable to store that initial top value. So we look in the code at the very. So this is where we go back and add a top value. So top value equals 8. So that's what he's going to use to store the initial 8 pixels from the top. If we read the next line, and start left at 7 pixels on each new row, right? So start left at each new row. We're going to start 7 pixels from the on each new row. So what he means by that is every row initially starts 7 pixels from the left, right? Actually, we'll get back to that. So there, you see each row starts 7 pixels from the left. It doesn't change. It's always 7 pixels from the left side. So we need but it's always gonna be set at 7 pixels each in a row. So every time it's done with this row, that left value is gonna go back to being 7 once it reaches new row. So the best way we're gonna do that is every time we loop for the row loop, the first thing we're gonna do in the row loop. So every time this loops once and it does everything in here, the first thing it's gonna do after it loops is we're gonna set left value back to 7, like he said, right here. Start left at 7 pixels on each new row. So every loop. So what about, hold on, before we continue, we haven't done the add the top and left CSS value to OS. So how we're going to add the top and left values to OS is, remember, he said it's 40 pixels wide, right? Or 40 pixels. So how we're going to add it is, we're going to add it right here. After we did the if else statement for the 80 pixels, if it's a enter or a plus sign, else everything is going to be 40 pixels. So after that, we're going to do OS equals OS, the top CSS attribute, plus the top value. And remember, top value is an integer. We need an HTML only takes string, so we need to parse it to .toString. I remember CSS attributes, if you're specifying a specific number for the attributes, needs to have pixels at the end of it. So it concatenates pixels at the end of it, semicolon. This is just how CSS attribute formatting works. And so we also have the left CSS attribute, like you said, top and left CSS values. And we're gonna have it set to whatever our left value is at the time it reaches this code. So left value, the left value we specified at the right here, left value equals 7, dot toString with a pixels and a semicolon. So that's how we're gonna set our top and left attributes, CSS attributes for our div blocks. So that's step number 3. But let's also look at this. We don't forget something else because he did tell us that each row is going to be 40 pixels tall and each column is going to be 40 pixels wide and each row is going to be 40 pixels tall. So what he means from that is this is 40 pixels tall, but remember our initial start from the top. Our initial start from the top, we set it initially at 8. So it starts at 8. But as we go down to a new row, our every div block in a new row is 40 pixels more about remember it's 40 pixels tall, so it's about 40 pixels more from the top. So what I mean by that is this is 8 pixels from the top, and so the first row is 40 pixels. So this right here, this spot right here is 48 pixels from the top, right? 48 pixels from the top. And now as we move to a new row, it's no longer 48 pixels on the top. It's 88 pixels on the top, right? This block right here is 88 pixels on the top, 88 pixels on the top, so on, right? But this third row is not 88 pixels on the top anymore. It's 128 pixels on the top because remember, these blocks are 40 pixels each, and we initially started at 8 pixels from the top, right? So by the third column, we're 128 pixels from the top, and so on. The fourth column is 168 pixels from the top, right? And the last column being 208 pixels from the top, right? So what that means is we know it's good every time it reaches a new row, it's gonna be 40 more pixels away from the top. So if we look in the code, this is the tricky part right here. At the end of his column, the last thing we're going to do in the column before we loop to a new column and move on to a new column, the first column, the last thing we're going to do after we make the first column is we're going to add 40 to the top value. Oh, sorry about that. I made a mistake. At the last thing, because remember we said every row is about 40 pixels more from the top. The last thing we're going to do in the row after we move to a new row, remember the first thing we did in the row was set it back to 7. So every time we're 7 pixels on the left. Remember we said we're 7 pixels on the left. So let's explain it like this. So we're 7 pixels on the left, but remember every div block is 40 pixels wide, right? So like I said with the column, that means this is 7 pixels on the left, but the second column is 47 pixels from the left. And the third column is 87 pixels from the left, right? And then the last column is 127 pixels from the left, right? 40, 80, actually, sorry about that. This, this is 7 pixels on the left, 7 pixels on the left. And this is 47 pixels on the left, right? 47 pixels on the left, 87 pixels on the left, 127 pixels on the left, and finally 167 pixels on the left. But if we don't reset the pixels back to 7 when we go to new row, then the new row would start right here instead of starting right here 7 pixels from the left. So that's why every time the first thing when we go through the row loop, the first thing we want to do is set the left value back to 7 so it starts from the 7 pixels from the left. And that's the same thing for the top value. because the last thing we want to do is after it goes through all 4 columns, we want it to increase the column to be 40 more pixels from the top, from the initial 8, so 48. So the last thing we're going to do in this row loop is we're going to keep adding 40 to it so that eventually it reaches to the last row and being about 208 pixels from the top, right? And that's why our top value is plus 40 is at the as the last thing we do in this row loop. And you see the left value though. Left value, we want the left value. We want the last thing every time it finishes a column loop because as we go through the columns, the div blocks get further and further away from the left side. So we want to add 40 as the last thing, as one of the last things we do for the column loop. So you see the column loop right here. One of the last things we do, we'll get back to this which key plus plus later, but last thing we're going to do currently is left value equals left val plus 40 because every column is going to be 40 pixels away from the left as if and 40 more from is going to keep getting 40 more away from the previous column. So incrementing by 40. 40 from here, 40 from here, 40 from here. And so that's why we put the left value equals left value plus 40 right there as one of the last things we do in the column loop. And so that's really tricky, but if you keep that in mind, it starts to make sense. So now that we have the top and left values set up for us, and now we've set it up, we move on to the next step. The next step is end the div tag with a closing part. Remember, because remember, this starting div tag has a beginning part of the tag, but it never finishes that tag. So we need to finish the tag after we've added all the CSS elements he wants to add. So we go in here, as we're finishing the tag by adding the height and adding the height in the left and top position, we add it in at the end of that. At the end of that, at the end of all the attributes we're adding into the div block right here. So OS equals all of the new CSS elements we've added, and then ending or closing beginning, closing up the beginning tag so it's finished. Right there. Okay, and that's basically step number 4. And so now substep number 5 is if the button text array at the which key element contains a comma, replace it with a break tag, right? So after we do that, we move on right exactly to the next part. If button text at the which key element dot index of a comma. Remember the index of returns position. So if it returns a position greater than 0, that means it exists. The reason you could have done -1 and works the same way. The reason the 0 works in here is because if you look inside the array, there is no comma that starts as the first. You see, there's no comma in the position 0 in any of these elements. So that's why 0 works. Okay, next. So if the comma exists, then we're gonna do. Remember, like you said, replace it with a break tag. He told us to replace it with a break tag right here for substep number 5. So how we're gonna do that is we're gonna do if it exists, the comma exists, then we're gonna do button text at the which key element where it exists. We're gonna replace it. So button text at the which key element equals button text at the which key element dot replace the comma with the break tag. And that's going to accomplish our goals for substep number 5. And finally, we're on substep number 6. Add the value for button text at the which key element to OS. So this is where we're going to add the value to OS, right? So The next thing, like I said, following instructions. Okay, so remember, we're following an order. We're gonna follow it in order. So add the value of button text at the which key element to OS. So OS equals OS plus the button text at the which key element, right? So that's that step, right? So that's the step number 6. And step number 7 is to add an ending div block to OS. And so we're going to add the ending div block here. This is step number 7, right? Finally, step number 8 is to increment which key by 1. And finally, we're going to increment which key by 1 right here. The reason we want to increment which key by 1 right here is because we want it to increment every time we've completed a div block. As every time we've completed a div block is after we loop once in the column loop, correct? So that's why the last thing we do in the column loop is we're going to increment which key by 1 like he told us to in substep number 8. And from that point on, that finishes the question. Basically, the last thing we have to do now is we just have to place our completed OS that has all our div blocks, all 18 key div blocks into P2 out. So to do that, it's simply just P2 out that inner HTML equals OS, and that basically finishes question number 2. So, and that's question number 2. Hopefully this helps you guys, and I hope good luck on the test.